Hello, it's Keith here, and it's a bit of a special video today. We're going to be looking at the Enterprise 128. Now, the Enterprise was a system that I ported Chibi Akimas to, but at that time I was only able to test it on emulators and had to rely on other users to actually test on physical hardware. The reason for this was, although I'd actually bought an Enterprise from eBay, I wasn't able to use it because I didn't have a video out or an SD card. You see, from the point of view of video out, the Enterprise outputs a coaxial signal which won't work on my Japanese TV, but more importantly, I had no cartridges for the system, so I couldn't boot even to BASIC, and obviously I wanted to be able to play games on it, so I needed an SD card converter. However, thanks to the user Szörg, who is clearly very good at hardware programming, and also whose name I probably horrendously mispronounced there, he has actually provided me with an SD card emulator, which will emulate a disk system, a video converter that will convert the RGB signal to a composite and S-video signal, so that I can now use the Enterprise in its full. And I was glad to find out it does actually work, because of course I'd never tested it, and eBay. So anyway, let's have a look at the hardware, see what the Enterprise looks like, and then we'll see some games using it.
Okay, so here we've got the Enterprise 128. Now, I bought this, I think it was about £200. It was quite expensive, maybe even 250, but anyway, it came without any kind of cartridges, which the system does need to load to BASIC. I believe it starts to a word processor without one, but you do need it to load to BASIC. It didn't come with any video cables, which is a problem for Japan because the analog TV out is coaxial and I can't connect that. Now, it also didn't come with the joystick cap, but that's not a major problem, I'll be honest. So fortunately, I now have this cartridge emulator here, which actually emulates a disk system. I've also got this video converter which will work with composite and S-video, so we're going to be using S-video today. And I've got a SD card that came with the disk emulator, and that's got lots of games on it, so we're going to try that. And finally, I also have this fake cap for the joystick, so we can use the joystick, which is very nice. So this is the Enterprise 128. There was an Enterprise 64 as well. I don't have one of those. Now, the system is basically quite similar to the CPC in some ways graphically. I think they effectively made it able to emulate the CPC intentionally, but it does have some graphics modes that are more advanced than the CPC, and we'll discuss a bit of what it can do as we use it. So, as I say, my system didn't come with any kind of power supply, and the machine needs a 9-volt center negative power supply, and that actually is the same as the ZX Spectrum. So I'm using my Spectrum power supply, which is actually a PlayStation power supply. This is 8.5 volts, but it's close enough, and I've redone the end, just swapping the polarity and what have you. So this outputs 9 volts center negative, or 8.5 volts at least, but it does work. And fortunately, the plug is actually the same plug, so I didn't need to worry about that. So we're going to get this machine set up then, and we'll have a look at what it actually looks like when it's running. Now, one thing I did find the other day is it actually has a built-in speaker. When it arrived, it was rattling horribly. I opened it up and the speaker had come loose. But the point I'm making is it doesn't seem to have any kind of volume control for the internal speaker. So because I was using the audio lines of this video out here, the internal speaker was playing away. So I've got this broken set of headphones, which I'm going to plug into the line out socket on the back, and hopefully that's going to shut up the internal speaker. Otherwise we're going to have this weird kind of stereo thing going on. But anyway, so to plug this in, we just put this in the side. You can see the shape. It's pretty much impossible to plug it in upside down, which is always good. This goes into the back. Now, one thing to note is these are unfortunately edge connectors, but they're non-standard sizes, and apparently I did try, and you apparently can't buy the correct sizes, so you have to buy bigger ones and hack them up. But that's fortunately been done for me, so we can just plug all of this in. So we just plug this into the back here, into the monitor port here, and then we plug this in to the side here. There we go. And we want to plug our SD card in before we switch on, of course. It's important not to unplug this out when you've switched it on, in case that needs saying. We'll plug our power in the back here. Then our S-video cable. Now I have two audio cables. I'll show this one and this one. And hopefully this is going to make it a bit quieter. I guess this goes into out. So that should be all set up to actually play the game. Now I do have a second SD card here. This is one that I modified, and I've actually put Chibi Akumas onto this. Now it is a bit tricky getting the files onto the SD cards. The SD cards need to have FAT12 partitions, and Windows can't do that by default. There is a piece of software you can download that allows you to edit the SD cards and put files straight onto it via drag and drop, and I will now put in some video guides showing how to use that.
Now, because the Enterprise SD card emulator can't work with FAT16, it has to work with FAT12, and Windows can't do that by default. But what you can do is, if you go to the manufacturer of the SD card emulator's website, there's some links to some good stuff that'll help you. One of those things is the free Partition Guru program. This will cope with the FAT12 partitions just fine, and there is also a disk image of the default disk SD card if you need to recreate it that you can download from that website as well. So here's a screenshot of the default image. You can see there's multiple partitions. Now the reason there's so many and there's this extended partition thing is, you may not know this, but standard disks can only have 4 partitions, and if you need to have more than that, you need to put them in an extended partition. So that's why it may look a bit confusing, but essentially you've got all of your partitions here, each of which is a FAT12 image. Now if you click on one of these partitions, you can expand it and you can see the folders in that partition, and then if you click on those, you can see the files in those folders, and then we can just put the files we want onto the disk image just by drag dropping them from Windows. So it's very straightforward there once you've got this disk image working. If you need to do more clever things, if you right click on the partitions, you've got a wide variety of options with regards to creating new partitions and cloning them, and I was able to clone all the partitions from the SD card I was provided onto a new SD card before I realised I could have just downloaded the image off the website. But anyway, a point I'm making is this software is very powerful, and it does allow you to do a lot of tasks that are very helpful for coping with these SD cards. So it's not a major problem that you can't use the SD card on your PC directly. But one thing I do have to warn you, there's a good reason I'm showing you screenshots of this software which are taken on my Windows XP netbook rather than my normal PC. If you use this software wrong, you could end up damaging your hard drive connected to your main PC. So for safety, I always use a second sacrificial PC, and this is for good reason because I have made that mistake before. Anyway, let's get back to the actual Enterprise.
Okay, so I'm going to turn the Enterprise on now. And so here we have the startup procedure. It's obviously detected the SD card, and we get the Enterprise splash screen. And now it's booting to BASIC. Now, as I said before, BASIC doesn't exist within the ROM of the system, so this is actually booting from the cartridge emulation here. And then if I press F1 here, this uses the start command of the Enterprise BASIC, and this boots to some software within the SD card. And now I can browse between the various drive letters on the SD card. So we've got drive F here, and if I press G, we can move to drive G and H and I and J here. Now you can see, unfortunately, the video signal isn't very clear, and I think this is my Japanese TV maybe not working so well with the PAL signal. But anyway, we should be able to play it okay. So let's have a look for a CPC game. So these are CPC games that have been converted to the Enterprise here. So let's try Sorcery here. And it looks like the game's loading. Now, as I say, the Enterprise does have very similar graphics to the Amstrad CPC in some ways, but one thing it doesn't have is the 16 colour mode is more limited on the top 8 colours. So the person doing the game conversion is going to have really had a challenge getting those second colours working. But it looks, if someone told me this was the CPC, I wouldn't have noticed. In case you didn't hear there, my idea of plugging the old headphones in hasn't worked, so I still have I can't remember how this game works. That doesn't kill that enemy, does it? There we go, that one does. I mean, the game plays really well. The Enterprise is actually slightly faster than the Amstrad CPC, so it should be able to play this fine. The screen mode, while by default the Enterprise screen mode isn't structured in the same way as the Amstrad CPC, it can be reconfigured to mimic it exactly. It's very flexible, so it's quite possible, didn't mean to do that, it's quite possible that they've done that to make the porting easier, and it really does just mean then that you've got the colours and the sound that are the challenge, because the Enterprise doesn't have an AY sound chip, but it can run an emulator, and that's how Chibi Akuma's did the sound as well. It used the AY emulation, which is very good. So I mean, this plays perfectly, to be honest. As I say, I wouldn't tell a difference. Although, my fake joystick has just fallen off though, so maybe we need to glue that on or something. Anyway, this works fine, so let's try a different game. Now, I've just pressed the reset button on the back, and if I now start up and press F1, you'll see it comes to file not found. What you have to do is hold down C and press the reset, and then it will force a cold reboot. And now if I press F1, we've got this menu back again. Now we've got 2 copies of total clips here. I wonder if there's a difference. No, I was wondering if one was the Spectrum version. As well as the Amstrad CPC, the Enterprise is very good at emulating the Spectrum. Oh yes, this actually does look like the Spectrum version. And that, the sound coming from both systems is quite surprising, because I've got it coming out the Enterprise and out of the screen. I have no idea how to control this with keys, it seems. Okay. Anyway, I mean, I'm not going to play that. You see, it does work fine. Okay. So someone's ported the Amiga ball bouncing demo, it looks like there. You might have noticed that this memory card does come with SymBOS installed on it. I'm not sure if it will run on this machine. I think it might, because it's got 128K, but I've not got any memory upgrades, so whether it will do very much after that, I'm not sure. Okay, so we had to run Sim there, and okay, so it does indeed work, okay. It doesn't seem to use my joystick, so I'm not sure what I control this with. Possibly nothing. I don't have an external joystick. They don't use the normal connectors, so I can't use my external joystick. But it seems it's not using my joystick unless it's actually crashed. So let's reset out of that then. So it looks like we've got a Spectrum version of Robocop here. The speech is very good anyway. Okay, what are my controls? Okay, here we go. It's a good conversion of the Spectrum version. I was kind of hoping for the Amstrad version, of course, because as I say, the Enterprise is very good at emulating the Amstrad. So let's just see if there's another copy. So it looks like quite a few of the games are copied from the Spectrum, which maybe that's easier to do. So anyway, that all looks pretty good, but what I'm going to do now, I'm going to swap the SD cards and try my Chibi Akuma's game on the Enterprise. Now, I could only test this during the development via emulation, so I did have a quick go yesterday just to check it actually loaded, but let's have a play on it on here. So you can see we've got this Chibi folder here, and then if we just run start, So that started basically instantly. Now the colours aren't quite as nice as they should be. The blending's not as subtle, and I think that's because of the TV I'm using here. But anyway, let's have a go at the game. So the sound isn't quite as good on this system, and that's because, as I've said before, it's using emulation. But apart from that, now you can't really tell on this screen because, as I say, it's kind of overdoing the colours. But the colours are basically the same on the Enterprise as the CPC Plus. It's able to do the raster colour effect, and because of the way the Enterprise screen works, it does it in hardware. There are no interrupts driving the colour changes. It's actually there's a lookup table of the screen addresses that the video hardware uses, and it's that's doing the color changes. So the colors don't have the kind of judder as the interrupts affect things like on the Amstrad CPC. But of course the Enterprise doesn't have any kind of hardware sprites, so that's why the Chibico character doesn't look as good as on the CPC Plus. But the Enterprise does offer some really quite impressive graphics, and as I say, it's perfectly emulating the CPC here. I did reprogram the sprite code to make it a bit more efficient because the Enterprise's lines are consecutive rather than having to jump around, so it's actually easier, and I reprogrammed it to take advantage of that. But from the point of view of the graphics, there were very few changes for the Enterprise version. Although the Enterprise version's 16 colour mode isn't as easy to use possibly as the CPCs, and it's certainly hard to convert a 16 colour game to the Enterprise, although I have seen it done because I was playing Chase HQ, the CPC version, on this yesterday, and it played and looked just fine. But the Enterprise does have a 256 colour mode. It's essentially half the resolution again of the Amstrad CPC 16 colour mode, so it's 80 pixels across by 200 pixels down. So a bit of a strange chunky mode, but certainly an impressive colour depth for an 8-bit machine. Now, of course, if you're interested in the Enterprise, I am doing tutorials on how to program it, and of course, if you watch those tutorials, you will be able to learn a little bit about how the actual hardware works through how to program it. So I definitely suggest you look at that if you are interested in seeing more of the Enterprise. And of course, there is a superb PC emulator that will allow you to run the Enterprise on your machine. So you don't need to buy this expensive and rare hardware and get it working to be able to play these games, because as I say, the Enterprise is really good. Unfortunately, it just didn't get many games released for it back in the day, but there's a very enthusiastic community releasing games for it and porting games for it now. I'm certainly planning to convert all of my future CPC games to it, because it took very little time to port to the Enterprise in this case. It only took about a month, but really the game was done in about 3 weeks. It was very, very quick because the hardware is so similar. And you can see here that it's all playing just fine. Okay, so I've had to do some experimentation because it's clearly harder to use than I understood originally. So now hopefully I can actually use it properly. Now, generally speaking, once you start it up, you can just press F1 and it will start into this menu here. So the first thing I think it's best for us to do is to have a look in this new folder, because there's some nice demos in here. So the first interesting one is this Wolf program. Well, what is this? Well, if we just wait a moment. We can see it's actually a first-person shooter. So I guess this is our Wolfenstein 3D clone here. Now obviously the main screen is only black and white here, but if you look at the top you can clearly see there's a lot of coloured gradation there. I can't actually work out how to open that door there. They seem to open when I shoot them or something weird. Oh no, they are opening automatically. I mean, the game is running really smooth. I mean, it's very fast. I'm just struggling a bit with the two colour graphics, I guess. But anyway, we can see it works. I'm not going to sit around playing that all day. So if I press the reset button on the back now, it'll go back to the quick boot up. And if I now press colon and type file, I should be able to get that menu back up, because if I press F1 it won't work anymore. Now the other alternative is to hold down the C button and press the reset at the same time, which will do a cold reboot. As well as that, we do have some demos, and this Genesis one is quite impressive. Now my plan of plugging in those old headphones into the internal speaker didn't work, so what I've done instead is I've disconnected the speakers of the TV and we're just hearing from the internal beeper speaker now. Now it's interesting to notice, looking at a demo like this, it looks very similar to the CPC demos, but the Enterprise, while it can do the same kind of graphics as the CPC, it can't do the raster tricks. The rasters, I don't think it's really got any of those kind of functions. It can do all kinds of strange remapping of the memory, but it can't do the hardware shifting of the screen layout in the same way. Okay, so you can see that, and then if we just go back in by typing file there. So we do have Symboss here, and it does seem to load, but I don't seem to be able to control it. I don't have a mouse for this system, and I think maybe I do need one, so I'm not going to try that. But I can press other letters here. This is drive F, but if I press G, we'll switch to drive G, H, I, and so on and so forth. Now these folders are programs that have been converted directly to the Enterprise, so we've got a wide variety here. But also, it took me a little while to figure this out, but if we go to if we go to I here, then we can go into one of these CPC folders, and we've got a, if we just browse down to CPC and run CPC-mu. Now this is quite curiously. He seems to be a CPC emulator, and if I do cat, you'll see that rather than showing any kind of tape listing, it actually shows the contents of the drive. And then I can do run shift dizzy, and we're now loading the Dizzy game. I might be wrong, but it seems that all of the games are 4-color because, as I've said before, the Enterprise can't so easily directly play 16-color games. Some have been ported. Chase HQ has been ported very successfully, but as I say, it can do native 4-color very well, but it can't do a 16-color without a little bit of work. But this looks and sounds exactly the same, and the speed's great as well. I mean, it might be slower, I can't say, but it doesn't feel in any way reduced, so really good, apparently, emulation. I guess it's running the firmware. It's got a sort of firmware that's been converted, and then it's running the screen in the same layout because the Enterprise can emulate the CPC screen layout. Okay, so this SD card cartridge device has a variety of functions. So if we type a colon here and do EX-DOS, we can get this disk operating system going up where we can do DIRs and things like that. But to be honest, we don't really need that too much. So if we just do exit here, we can go back to basic. Actually, I think I shouldn't have done that command. I think I should have done a different one. But we can also, before when we did that F1 to start, that won't work a second time, but if we do :file, that should bring up the same menu, and we can browse around and use various things in here. Now, one thing that is quite tricky, and it took me a while to understand it, if we go to this folder here on the L drive, there's this music player called DTM, and what we can do is we can start this up, but then it looks like maybe it didn't work or it crashed or something, but it's actually loaded into memory. So if I do :help, you'll see now it says DTM is loaded into memory. If I now type DTM, if I type :DTM, now the file menu has loaded up again, but it's actually going to work slightly differently this time, because if I select one of these songs, we can now play the song through that DTM tracker that's in memory. And so this is essentially a mod tracker running through the Enterprise's CPU, which is really quite impressive because when I used to use mod trackers, it was on a 386 computer, and it really pushed those even back then. So I'm very impressed to see this running on here. But anyway, so that's another thing we can do here. But it is important to notice it does use up some of the memory. But anyway, I keep using the wrong command there. It's file, not file. Files plural. So as we said before, there is there's the CPC emulators in here, and it seems to be a Spectrum emulator in here as well. But the other lettered folders are games that have been sort of converted, so they are now running native on the Enterprise, and obviously they're going to tend to be better. So the one I wanted to show you is this Chase HQ2 here, because this seems to have been fairly well ported. Because, as I said before, the 16-color games are going to be quite tricky to port to the Enterprise because the extra colors don't necessarily work as well. But this one does seem to have been done quite nicely. So we seem to have digitized speech here. Now, I only really played Chase HQ on the Amstrad CPC, and this, I believe, is Chase HQ2. And my machine was a 64K, so I can't really comment on what the speech was actually like on the Amstrad CPC. But as I say, this looks really good. I don't know if the colours are anyway inferior on this version, but they look great. As I say, my TV hardware here does tend to be making the colours a little bit worse than they should be. But anyway, this looks really good. I'm not playing so well on the tiny little joystick, but never mind. So anyway, we'll just reset that and we'll have a look at some other things on here then. Now we also have this Interlaced Viewer here, which allows you to view some images. Now it doesn't tend to work so well on my strange TV because this is a HDMI TV, and so it's not CRT, and it won't really work with interlaced effects very well. But we also have some weird video files in here. I'm not quite sure about this thing. So if I start this up, you can see we are actually playing some kind of video animations here that are being streamed from memory. Maybe it doesn't look like the disk's still being accessed, but it certainly look quite good. Now this one does seem to be streaming from the disk. It's very impressive. And it seems to have dropped out back to the command line there. So, I mean, basically we have an awful lot of games on this preloaded onto this SD card, and it's really good. It's a little bit tricky to use as a beginner because the trouble is, for me, I'm not really used to the Enterprise at the best of times. I'm also not sure what the fire button is on this. Anyway, so not being so familiar with the Enterprise, I've had to do a little bit of reading up to work out how the commands work. But I mean, all in honesty, I can run all of the games that I've so far come across. It just took a little bit of figuring out how they worked. And the most important thing for me is I'm able to run my Chibi Akima's game on it, because when I wrote it, I wasn't able to test it on real hardware, so I had to rely on other people to do that for me. And they were kind enough to do so, but obviously as a developer, if you come across problems, you really want to be able to test them yourself. But it seems really pretty decent to use once you get used to how the commands work. It's very functional. You just have to use that editor to add extra files to the disk images. But that said, unless you're developing your own stuff, there's so much stuff on here already. It's really pretty complete. So, as I say before, I definitely encourage you to try out the Enterprise, even if it's just by emulation, because it's a really quite powerful system, and it's one that I'd never heard of, even though apparently it originally came from the UK. So one that you should try checking out if you're not familiar with it. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed this video today, and hope you've learned a little bit about the Enterprise and this SD card system for it. Anyway, thanks for watching, and goodbye.